What I love about cybersecurity. Go.
I love the fact that a whole group of strangers have all embraced the noble purpose of protection and that we all managed to get along and sort of head towards the right mission, at least for the most part.
It's time to begin the CISO Series podcast.
Welcome to the CISO Series podcast. My name is David Spark. I am the producer of said CISO Series. My co-host for this episode, he's had 3 jobs since we've started. It's Mike Johnson. He's the CISO of Rivian. Mike, thanks for joining us.
Wow. When you put it in those words, David.
It sounds like you were a failure.
Oh, thanks. Yeah. Appreciate that.
No.
Yeah. Thank you for the support, David. I'm so glad to be here.
I'm glad that you're here as well. We're available at CISOseries.com. Our sponsor for today's episode is Eclipsium. Trust your tech from core to cloud. More about Eclipsium later in the show. And in fact, Eclipsium is responsible for bringing our guest today, who I want to introduce because he was the second ever host of the CISO series, actually outside, let's say third, you and me, the first, and then he was the host of the second show on the CISO series. He has gone on to do his other show himself. Actually, he has a show called the Cyber Ranch Podcast, and he is now over at Eclipsium as their CISO, our sponsored guest and good friend of the show, none other than Alan Alford. Alan, great to see you back again.
Howdy, y'all.
All right. The reason I'm bringing you in early, because you have a long history in podcasting and because Mike has a long history in podcasting, this is something that has come up, and this is my podcasting pet peeves. I have a bunch of them. Before anything comes out of your mouth, I'm going to start with you, Mike. Then we're going to get to Alan. Give me 1 or 2 of your biggest podcasting pet peeves. And it's about other people's shows, not the brilliance that we create on this show.
No, it's certainly not about this amazing show.
By the way, I don't believe we've ever made a mistake. Have we, Mike?
Not once. Not that anyone has heard. Editing is great.
Yes.
For me, it's the oddly inserted ads that have nothing to do with the show. I know why they have to do them, but they're so distracting to get a commercial for toilet paper while I'm listening to something deep about financial news.
Well, the great thing about a toilet paper ad is that everyone uses it.
Very true. Good point.
It is actually targeted to everybody.
Yes.
Universal applicability.
But if you use one of these ad insertion services, you really have no idea. And it also changes by the location. I was saying I was in Amsterdam and I downloaded some shows for the flight and I got ads in lots of different languages.
Even better. They're more entertaining that way.
All right. Alan, your top pet peeve with the podcasting.
It's when the guest switches from talking in a normal tone in the microphone, and then all of a sudden you get all the sounds as they get right on the mic and move their head around.
Or do they do the mic drift where they fall off the microphone further away and then they come back again like that?
That's another good one. Plosives, sibilance, and mic drift.
Mm-hmm.
We'll try and replicate all of those today just for you, Alan.
My least favorite is the ramp up, and it comes in many different forms. One is how was your weekend, Alan? Mike, does anyone actually care? No, I don't believe anyone does. And the second, they want to start a topic and there's sort of an endless ramp up till they get to the point. I don't need the ramp up. Get to the point. That's my aggravation.
Cut to the chase.
Mm-hmm. Many hour-long podcasts could just be 20 minutes long. This show is not 20 minutes, nor is it an hour long. It's somewhere in between. And we're going to cut to the chase right now. Are you ready, Alan?
I am ready.
Let's talk community.
What can a private organization do to foster public-private partnerships? We've seen a lot of top-down approaches recently, most notably CISA's Join Cyber Defense Collaborative. But Christopher White at CISO Online argued for more bottom-up approaches. He pointed to leveraging collective agency through civil defense groups, internalizing the need to speak publicly about risks and vulnerabilities as a net positive, using sources from academia, supporting workforce pipeline tie-ins, and investing in vendors that best benefit community security. Any of these represent, and I know it, massive coordination. So, Mike, I'm going to start with you. How can we cut through and start seeing benefits across any of these as quickly as possible? And by the way, I think we're all on board that we would love to have more public-private partnerships. Yes?
I think that's true. I also think we've been talking about public-private partnerships forever.
Mm-hmm.
This is not a new topic in cybersecurity.
And these solutions, I think, are known, but feel very arduous to achieve.
I think that there's this presumption of what the solution is, like what a public-private partnership looks like. There's a belief that it is the government giving private companies threat intelligence. Those companies are then using that to defend themselves better. There's this presumption that that's what it is. But the reality is there's a lot that's going on today that we just don't give folks credit for. We have the architecture guides from CISA. We've got NIST CSF 2.0 was basically written in significant partnership between the government and private entities. The Cyber Safety Review Board, that's one of those cases where you have private companies that are sitting on the Cyber Safety Review Board, but are working on behalf of CISA. So I think the reality is we have a lot of this going on today. It's just not what people think they want. And that thing that they want isn't going to work very well for the government because they can't declassify information in order to pass it along to the private sector.
That seems like the giant rub there. Alan, what do you feel is working, not working? Things could be they sped up. Where do you stand?
I want to bring up open source right off the bat. I want to bring up the open source world because everyone's heard of the tragedy of the commons, this idea that if it's a communal property, everyone will take advantage of it and nobody will sustain it, right? And if you look at the role of private sector versus government in society, private sector is there to make money, create jobs, develop an economy, and government is there to maintain the things that nobody else would do, right? It's the communal infrastructure, the commons, if you will. And so for me, this idea that the open source movement is starting to see government support packages and modules and et cetera that are being used all throughout society, everywhere, stuff that isn't being maintained necessarily by any private individual or isn't being secured by any private individual. Governments are stepping in and contributing to open source and sort of solving that tragedy of the commons problem. And so you're starting to see some of that in the open source world. And then you see things like the ChipSec project. You see things like OWASP. There's a lot of already extant cooperation between the two entities. It's already happening. And I think open source is a huge area for that to occur. And then you get into things like InfraGard. You get into things like the Open Source Software Institute. I'm back to open source. But what those guys do in particular is they will take an off-the-shelf module like OpenSSL and they will run it through a FIPS 140-2 validation. And now everybody has a FIPS validated version of OpenSSL available to them. So I think the open source world is really doing this a lot. And there's smaller things too, like Josiah Dykstra, who was at the NSA at the time, co-wrote a book with somebody from the academy, somebody from the industry, and sort of all three jointly putting together a cyber book. There's a lot of smaller examples. There's a lot of bigger examples, but I tend to lean on open source when it speaks to sort of how the collaboration can occur.
How can we secure new technology without creating new risks?
Can we keep pace with risk assessments during the current LLM arms race? LLM being large language models. With the tech industry investing billions to stay on the cutting edge, monolithic benchmarks of performance and trustworthiness are almost impossible, argued George Hammond in a recent piece for the Financial Times. Now, this might be true, but it also hides the fact that as an industry, we also struggle to do proper risk assessments on new technologies. Before the cloud, take SaaS, for instance. So, Alan, is this a real issue we need to figure out, like doing risk assessments as we're building these LLMs? Or is the disruptive potential of these ascendant LLMs causing us to over-index this already existing problem? Like, we do this with any new technology. Are we just overstressing ourselves out with LLMs?
Yeah. So in the 80s, we had the PC revolution. Once upon a time, everybody was on the centralized mainframe and all computing was controlled centrally. And then these awful PC things started getting scattered across the four winds. And suddenly the risk profile and the attack surface changed and everybody freaked out about how can we possibly contain this mess? Well, we did. And then came this thing called the internet in the 90s, and it started all over again, distributed computing and stuff all over the planet. And how do we possibly contain? We did. And then came the cloud revolution of the 2000s. Guess what? We secured it. So I think there's a lot of hype with each new wave that comes out. I think each new wave of technology gives us a moment where we're thinking to ourselves, oh no, how can we possibly? But at the end of the day, it's increased attack surface or it's altered attack surface. And we just sort of accommodate that and include it in our risk register. And we just kind of move forward and start to take it on. If you break it down and look at LLM, all we're really saying is there's a risk now. This new toy is out there that people are plugging data into. So there's a risk of data going out the door into the LLM. And then there's the risk of the LLM itself, hallucinating, whatever kind of mess ups might occur as you utilize it and incorporate it in your business life. Okay, so we've added really two categories of risk is about it. And one of them is solved by the same kinds of DLP technologies, and the other one is solved by human intervention and not just leaning hard on the LLM, but assuming that a human needs to edit and review and sort of double check facts and figures and that sort of thing. So I don't think it's a daunting proposition, LLM. I think it's overcomable. I think we just add to our risk register. I think we alter our model of attack surface, and we're getting to the same place we got with all the other revolutions that came before.
You got personal data going into SaaS. You got personal data going into LLMs. I mean, it's the same thing, right, Mike?
Yep.
I really view it as the same thing. There's a box that you put data into, it does something, and then the data comes back out. We have to think about it a little bit differently, but at the root of it, it's the same risk that we've dealt with.
By the way, is this your opening line to the board? It's a box. Stuff comes in, stuff comes out.
Probably not to the board, but at the same time, I'm not talking to the board about the risks of AI.
That's a good point.
That's not a conversation that we're having. But if I am having a conversation internally around how are we assessing the risk of this new LLM that we're wanting to use, we do talk about the fact that it's similar to what we've seen before, so we should treat it the same way. As Alan was saying, you look at the data that's going into it. So you have some controls around the data that goes into it. You worry about what happens with the data within the LLM. Is it mixing? Is it going to be training data for other models that other people can perhaps get the data back out? And then what are we doing with the data? Are we using that to make legal decisions? In which case, we really need to make sure that we've got some review of that output. It's the same thing that we deal with time and time again, just looks a little bit different this time.
Honestly, it comes down to classifying it. If you don't have it classified in the cloud, it's a pain to manage. If you don't have it classified in the LLM, it's a pain to manage. If you have it classified, you can manage it whether it's in the cloud or the LLM. Am I right?
If you know what data is going in and you know what data is coming out of it, then you have a really good chance of securing it. But if you don't know those things, then you're going to have a bad day.
And it doesn't matter where the heck it is, you're going to have a bad day.
Exactly.
Before I go any further, I do want to tell you about our awesome sponsor, and that is Eclipsium. Now, this episode is sponsored by Eclipsium, the leader in supply chain security for critical software, firmware, and hardware in enterprise infrastructure. Now, CISO Series listeners can learn more about Eclipsium by visiting their site, eclipsium.com/spark. Now, that's a little extra add-on. I'm going to spell it for you later. But there you will find the ultimate guide to supply chain security. It's an on-demand webinar presented by Paul Asadorian called Unraveling Digital Supply Chain Threats and Risk, which is a paper on the relationship between ransomware and the supply chain and a customer study with DigitalOcean. So there's a lot of good stuff in there. So if you're interested in seeing their product in action, you can also sign up for a demo, and you get that all at the site I just mentioned. It is eclipsium.com/spark. Let me spell that for you. It's ECLY eclipsium.com/my last name, Spark. eclipsium.com/Spark.
It's time to play What's Worse?
It's time to play What's Worse. Alan definitely knows how to play this, so I'm not going to explain it to him again, but I'll explain it to our audience. If this is the first time you've listened to our show, we have two horrible scenarios. They both stink, but it's a risk management exercise. You have to tell me which one of the two is worse. Now, this one came from the Twitter stream Bad Things Daily. I essentially picked two of them that I thought were mildly comparable in terms of badness, and you have to decide, Mike, which one's worse. Are you ready?
Yes.
Has there been a time I said, are you ready? And you said, no, David, let's wait for at least 15 minutes.
David, I was born ready.
Is that what your mother says?
Yes, absolutely. She knows. She knows I'm on it.
You came out of the womb and she said, plow the fields.
And I was just out there that day.
There you go. This is the first scenario. Subscribers to your newsletter are reporting targeted attacks towards the emails they subscribed with. Not good. Your newsletter list has been getting attacked. Or your on-call, so your on-call SOC, your MSSP, whatever, is super pumped because they haven't seen any incoming alerts for a while. And while, we don't know how long that is, but for a while. All right.
For a while.
Mike, which one of these is worse?
Wow. Okay. So in the first one, you have basically a known compromise. Something somewhere, somehow they've gotten a hold of these email addresses. You don't know how they got them, right? That's kind of the first.
Somebody leaked them.
They're out there. And the second one is everything is just quiet and you don't know why.
Which, who knows? Maybe they really are quiet. Maybe defenses are so fantastic that you have rebuffed everything and nobody can even get the outer shell that you could even see anything. Or all the hackers have decided to take some time off. And I'm saying the criminal hackers.
Sure, that could totally be the case.
It's never happened, but maybe it could.
Never happened that way. And that one kind of comes across to me as it's quiet, but it's too quiet.
It's like when the kids are in the house and you don't hear any noise. What's wrong?
Yeah, what's wrong? And so one of the things that I've been pretty consistent on this show is the unknown is always more concerning to me. And
you have said that before.
The first one, I kind of like, okay, this is a problem. Basically, I can figure out what happened in that first case. The second one, it could be quiet that all of our detection and monitoring is offline and the attackers have just been running rampant. Who knows what they've done?
Or nothing could have happened.
Yeah, I'm an optimist, but I'm also in security. So I don't believe that nothing happened. So that, to me, the unknown is the worst one. So the second one is the worst one.
Because you don't like free-floating anxiety. But Alan, Do you love free-floating anxiety?
I'm actually going to agree with Mike, and here's why. The newsletter email list. Who knows where those addresses were also used? It may not have been you. For all you know, it's everybody who attended the same conference or everybody who went with whatever. I mean, I tend to give the same address out when I subscribe to things, sign up with things, talk to vendors, go to shows, etc. It's not the same address I use for my daily life, right? So if that's the one getting hit, it could have been used all kinds of places. So I'm not going to take the credit or the blame or say I'm culpable just because there seems to be a Venn diagram of overlap, right? Not going to worry about that one so much. All's quiet on the Western Front, on the other hand. That's a whole nother story, right? Because at a minimum, you should be seeing the bot traffic. You should be seeing the attempts. Everyone knows you take a Windows box, you slap it on the internet with no firewall, it's going to be compromised within milliseconds. And you will see 10 bajillion attempts from the bots just looking for and scanning for, does it have this vulnerability? Does it have that one? You'll even get hit with the bots that are looking for an Apache Linux combo on your Windows box. You'll still see all that stuff. So if you're not seeing any of that in your SOC, you're blind.
All right. Alan agrees with you, but I think he gave a more detailed answer. So Alan is more correct than you are.
Way to go, Alan.
Wow, I'm correct.
More correct.
More correct.
You get 2 gold stars. Mike only gets 1.
Oh.
Please, enough. No, more.
Today's topic is supply chain security. Mike, this is a ludicrously hot topic, so I'm going to begin with you. And actually, you work for a business where you are dealing with this more than you've ever dealt with before. So what have you heard enough about with supply chain security, and what would you like to hear a lot more?
You really kind of hit it with that point. When I joined a company that makes physical things, the supply chain is very different than when you're making software. And I really think we talk too much about the supply chain and referring to it as just software. That's what people go to. That's what people talk about. They talk about your open source libraries. And so I've heard enough about just limiting it to open source and whether or not you're using open source. What I would really like to hear more about is looking at supply chains holistically. The fact that it's not just, are you using an open source library? You've got an entire chain that you have to worry about here. And so I'd like to see more, just let's be more holistic and more broad-based when we're talking about supply chain and supply chain security.
Let's see the full picture, because there's a lot to it. I remember we had the CISO for Lexmark on, and I can't remember the number, but it was like an endless number of suppliers he had to worry about for printers and copiers at Lexmark.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Alan, I throw this to you. It is the bailiwick over at Eclipsium. What have you heard enough about when it comes to supply chain security, and what would you like to hear a lot more?
Yeah, so this is what we do. And let me start with my own personal background on all this. Like, I grew up in a video conferencing industry. That's where I first really dove into a security career, transitioning from an IT career. Was at
Polycom, correct?
Yes, sir. I was at Polycom. And we made endpoints. We made audio endpoints. We made video endpoints. We made back-end infrastructure that switched and bridged and did all the magical things on the back end that you have to do. And so I grew up not with AppSec, but with ProdSec, which to me is inclusive of AppSec, right? Yes, there was tons and tons of software in these devices, but there was also a boatload of hardware. And hardware is mixed so amazingly. You've got CPUs, you've got GPUs. Everyone knows about those. When you get into BIOS and you get into firmware and you get into embedded code, you get into integrated systems, there's all of this other stuff going on. There's FPGAs. There's FPGAs, for those who don't know, picture a chip that you just Lego brick tons and tons of code into, and you can build out a code stack inside a chip with what might be open source, might be manufactured, proprietary, privately owned, maybe some combination thereof. Like, there's so much code below the surface, just so much stuff below the surface. And prior to that, I actually worked at a company that manufactured full systems, putting chips on motherboards, kinds of things. And these guys even subcontracted for the military. And it was amazing to see one change to one chip on the product line and what all was involved in the convolutions that had to be gone through. So you'd start with, let's say, a Japanese chip. You're cranking out this motherboard, and chip number 13 on the board is some particular Japanese chip that does some particular thing. And then one day you find out there's a comparable chip coming out of the Philippines that does all the same stuff and can be an equal substitute, and it costs 0.05 cents per unit cheaper, which for a manufacturer that's cranking $1 million an hour or $1 million a day on the assembly line, these little tiny differences in price matter hugely. But then you have to validate and verify the integrity of whatever you're getting, right? I mean, the DoD is concerned about these things. The private sector should be as well. And so you get to a state where you're looking at things like BIOS, firmware, CPU, GPU, all these types of things all have loaded stuff in them. And you get into questions about whatever that stuff is. So question number one, does it have the integrity? Is it really the right version that it should be? Is it what it claims to be? That's question number one, because you may have third parties trying to interject or interfere. Number two, is it the one recommended by my manufacturer? Is it up to date? Is it the right current one? Number three, is it in some way, shape, or form altered or compromised or doing stuff off the board? The data in and data out. Is there anything fishy going on? Like, you have to start looking at all these kinds of things. So Eclipsium steps in and does exactly that. That's exactly what we're doing over there. We're looking at all this stuff.
Let me pause you for a second. I'm interested in the story. What have you seen? What kind of behavior do you see often?
Yeah, we've seen bad guys insert code that was doing things like sniffing and detecting. Way back when I was in IT, before I was even in security, we're talking like late 90s, I want to say, there was a big scandal where Cisco supply chain, the actual official supply chain where you're ordering your Cisco parts from your dealers, right? It turns out that a whole bunch of bootleg Chinese cards made it into the market. And these cards were found to be deployed at places like U.S. Navy intelligence. And it's not just, hey, we're not getting the goods we paid for. It's like, wait a second, this is the switch at the center of my network through which all of my data passes. what's on that board and what's it doing? What's it sniffing? What's it looking at? What's it relaying and sending out to the cloud? Or, well, back in those days, there was no cloud, but you get the idea. So it's these kinds of things. We see this stuff. We see the bad guys stealing data.
But let me pause. I mean, I realize that a lot of people buy a device and to them it's a black box.
Yeah.
And correct me if I'm wrong, Eclipsium is saying, here's what's going on in your black box.
Yeah, exactly. We're cracking it open and showing you what's happening. And there's other manufacturing concerns. Picture a mainstream PC manufacturer, I won't name which one, who offers two product lines of laptops, one aimed at consumers and one aimed at business. The promise to the business is we will maintain the same chips and chipsets and units over time. For a 3-year contract, you'll get the same system. So if you order one, replacement one 2.5 years from now, it's going to be guaranteed to be the same machine. You can fire the same software onto it. All of everything's going to work consistently and predictably and all that. But their consumer line is free for all, right? Like just whatever the cheapest chip of the week is what goes into that sucker. And even then, after that 3-year cycle, you're going to see re-up chips, right? This stuff is occurring all the time, always. And when I first signed on with Eclipsium, of course, being the nerd I am, the very first thing I did was I said, I want access to the tool and I want to load it at home on the home network. And I blasted it onto absolutely everything on the home network that I could find and put it on. And I started sniffing around and looking. And mind you, I already have EDR. I already have next gen AV. I already have all the stuff running. Eclipsium found, I want to say it was a grand total of 7 things on my network that weren't right.
Like, give me an idea.
Well, this one was the really scary one. I actually updated the BIOS myself on my main gaming PC. And I went to what I thought was the official manufacturer's website and downloaded what I thought was the official real BIOS.
To our audience, Mike just made a very distressing face.
Everything looked legit. And of course, I'm over at a Taiwanese site downloading the English language version, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah, Eclipsium went through it and was like, yeah, that's not the real one, dude. I don't know what it was doing. I don't want to know what it was doing, but I nuked, eradicated, and got on the right one very promptly after that, right? So
it's amazing. Like, you could think you're doing all the right things, but it just goes back to this is what's going on in the black box you just bought.
That's exactly it. And we're expanding, right? So Eclipsium is getting beyond just firmware and BIOS now. We're starting to look at software. We're starting to look at IoT devices and all manner of other stuff out there. I mean, you got cameras on your network, you've got video conferencing endpoints, audio endpoints, there's all kinds of stuff. The printers, like the potential to dig into this stuff is vast. Like we're just constantly growing in scope of what we identify and find.
What annoys a CISO?
Everyone has seen a coworker with a password-laden Post-it on their monitor. Coworkers putting systems at risk isn't anything new, but a recent thread over on the cybersecurity subreddit tried to tease out the most common. One of the most common was putting confidential data on personal devices and accounts. Another was actively bypassing automated email protection systems to let them send sensitive data in the clear. And leaving computers unlocked was another common pain point. Now, several commented that the mere existence of coworkers was the worst offender. We know that, the safest computer, the one that's turned off and not connected to anything. And of course, the classic BYOD running Windows 7. So I'm going to start with you, Mike. Which of these are the easiest to manage and which are the trickiest? And you can bring in your own that I have not mentioned.
So first, a brief rant. I don't consider passwords on Post-it notes to be viable threats anymore for most orgs.
Alan is giving the thumbs up. He agrees with you.
The only place where that happens is in movies and TV shows. Like, as long as you aren't, some sort of evil genius in a TV show, you're probably okay with Post-it notes.
Have you hired an evil genius?
Not that I'm aware of. I haven't seen any Post-it notes. So
there you go.
Yeah, I think we're okay. But overall, this list, I mean, it's interesting. And aside from the having coworkers point, there's generally technical controls for all of them. DLP can handle putting confidential data in the wrong place. Idle timeouts can make sure your computers are locked. BYOD can be handled with conditional access. All of those can be handled with technical controls. But one of the things that was mentioned, and I don't think you mentioned it, but it was in the article, was intentionally defeating controls to send sensitive data in the clear. That one's really difficult to deal with. You've essentially got an employee who's working against you. They're actively defeating your controls.
But this can be done two different ways, maliciously and I'm just trying to get my job done.
Exactly. And the latter means that your security team isn't doing what they're needing to do. They're not listening to the input.
I need a tool that can do this and you can't do it, so I'm going to get my own app, and hence we get shadow IT.
Exactly. Yes. That, and therein lies tears, because you're now shadow IT everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
That's why we do have to be very careful with our policies and make sure we're empowering the workforce. That's the only way that you can deal with that one. But the rest of these we can just solve with technical controls. So I'm not worried about most of them.
So, Alan, you're on board with the sticky notes with the password, just no big deal. Is there an issue that does become a big deal outside of what Mike said, or you want to double down on that?
I'm going to double down on what Mike said, and I'm going to give you my super simple maxim that we must all remember in this field.
Mm-hmm.
Any security control must acknowledge how the affected employee is measured. That's it. That's the simple statement. If we are implementing security that gets in the way of how an employee is measured in their daily tasks and job, they're going to bypass that security however fiercely they can do it, right? That's the single biggest concern, is ourselves getting in the way of employees doing their jobs. As soon as we do that, as soon as we make security the uncomfortable choice, as soon as we make security contrary to what they know they need to do to be successful in their jobs, that's when we're actually screwing it up, right? Post-it notes, not that big a deal. It's more of a trope than it is a risk, right? Don't use public Wi-Fi is another one, right? Everybody always says, don't use public Wi-Fi. We've got firewalls. We've got VPN. We've got SASE. We've got 10 bajillion technologies. I'll hop on public Wi-Fi, and I'm cautious about what I do, and I make sure the encryption is happening, and I'm okay with it, right? It's not that big a deal. I don't know if you remember, like maybe about 8 years ago, every conference you went to, the doodad they gave out, the swag they gave out was that little USB block data allow power adapter.
Right. I picked one up at RSA.
And we all thought we needed those. We had them everywhere 8 years ago. When's the last time you saw one of those? Right?
I saw one at RSA this current year. I grabbed one.
Did you really? Because
Yeah.
I haven't seen one in forever.
Wow.
And it's because people are pretty smart about, oh, that's actually power. Oh, that might be data. And even then the phone says, do you want to trust this source? No, I don't. Again, we have protections and we have controls for these.
Yeah, the phone can tell you if data is going through.
Yeah. So I can power off my PC all day long without allowing data exchange, and it doesn't pop up and show as a device that is a data storage device, right? You just tell it, no, you're going to run power. You're not going to run data. It's pretty straightforward.
But this also speaks to the security community as well, in that you talked about like how are employees using technology, and both of you listed off a slew of different things that protect it, because we've been watching and listening. And if everyone's going to do this, yelling at them constantly to stop doing it is not going to get everyone. So we need essentially a fail-safe system to deal with it. Do you think we have been in all cases or most cases working in this direction?
I think we're headed there. I think more of us are aware of how it needs to go. And I think the feedback from the community that we're serving is pretty blunt when we're screwing it up. And I think we just need to be better listeners, and I think we'll get through there. Imagine you're in the marketing department and your whole job is to get 1,000 emails out the door every day. And then somehow some security solution that Alan employs or deploys or whatever is keeping that 1,000 down to some smaller number because of false positives and blockages and whatever. Like at some point you're just going to be mad at Alan. Like it's pretty straightforward.
Oh, no, you're going to look for another solution. And there are other solutions.
Yeah.
And you could be mad at Alan. You could do both.
Right. Why not both?
All right, Mike, close us out on this.
So, Alan, thank you for joining us. It was great kind of getting the gang all back together again. So it was so wonderful to sit down with you again. So
Yeah.
thank you for joining. One of the things I really want to highlight to the audience, though, your comment about security must acknowledge how employees are measured. I think that's great. I think people really need to take that with them and recognize our job is to help make the employees be productive. And if we don't understand what makes them productive, we're going to probably totally wreck their productivity. So I really think that's a quote that folks should take with them. So thanks for sharing that. Thanks for sharing your knowledge, your experience, but really thanks for giving me the opportunity to sit down and hang out with you again.
Oh, shucks.
It's awesome to have Alan back. Now, Now, Alan, before you say anything else, I'm going to let you have the last word here. I do want to mention your awesome company, and that'd be Eclipsium. Trust your tech from core to cloud. Supply chain security. We talked about it. Alan gave a great description on how they're doing it. Just know what the hell's happening with your devices. Like, what's in that thing that you don't really know what's in it? I think that's awesome. Check them out. Eclipsium.com/spark. That's my last name. ECLYPSIUM.com/spark. All right, Alan, I'll let you have the last word. Tell us anything you'd like about yourself, Eclipsium, whatever.
Yeah, so the one thing I wanted to mention is if you go and look at the database of known exploits, not vulnerabilities, but known exploits, you will see that there's actually more below the OS than above the OS. Stop and think about that for a moment. That's insane. The greater majority are actually not being addressed by EDR, not being addressed by Next-Gen AV, not being addressed by SOC-SIM. Eclipsium is there digging through that layer and solving those problems, and that's huge. So, I mean, I love Eclipsium, right? I joined for a reason. I mean, you guys know I'm friends with half the industry, and there's lots of places I could go. And Eclipsium is the one I chose. I believe in the product. I believe in the team. I believe in the vision and the mission. I think we're solving a huge problem that is not being solved elsewhere. And like I said, the sky's the limit. The amount of stuff we are ingesting and starting to solve for is, we've expanded into software. It just goes crazy from here. It just gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And soon you'll be able to come to us and say, I want to verify the integrity, authenticity, and security of fill in the blank, and we'll be able to do so.
That is damn cool. Remember, Eclipsium.com/spark. Check it out. Thank you so much, Alan. Thank you very much, Mike. And thank you to our audience. We greatly appreciate your contributions and for listening to the CISO Series podcast.
That wraps up another episode. If you haven't subscribed to the podcast, please do. We have lots more shows on our website, CISOseries.com. Please join us on Fridays for our live shows, Super Cyber Friday, our virtual meetup, and Cybersecurity Headlines Week in Review. This show thrives on your input. Go to the Participate menu on our site for plenty of ways to get involved, including recording a question or a comment for the show. If you're interested in sponsoring the podcast, contact David Spark directly at david@cisoseries.com. Thank you for listening to the CISO Series podcast.